And if you're sitting beside someone for whom it is difficult to stand, just sit down with them. But otherwise, let's stand and sing God of grace and God of glory.
God of grace and God of glory, on thy people pour thy power, crown thine ancient church's story, bring her forth to glorious power, grant us wisdom, grant us courage, for the facing of this hour. Lo, the host of evil round us, from the fears that long have bound us, free our hearts to faith and praise. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the living of these days, for the living.
Listen to see if you're in the next verse.
Cure thy children's warring madness, bend our pride to thy control, shame our wanton selfish gladness, rich in things and poor in soul. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage, lest we miss thy kingdom's goal, lest we miss thy kingdom's goal. Save us from weak resignation to the evils we deplore. Let us search for thy salvation, be thy glory evermore. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage, serving thee whom adore, serving thee whom we adore.
Amen. We just heard we learn much of our theology through our singing. Listen up.
Surprise sound, guys, I'm going to use this mic instead. Does Carol have a voice or what? Oh my gosh. She got all the singing talent that bypassed me. And we are blessed with our musicians, Nancy Miner and Jonathan Emmons. You don't know how hard they've been working. Nancy practiced so hard that before she came here that her husband broke his thumb. So, well, good morning. I am happy that you made it back this morning. That's good. I want to again welcome those of us in the room and our virtual participants. We have 9 Brethren retirement communities who are participating virtually this year, and I'm going to read the names. Hold your applause till the end. Brethren Village, Lidditz, Pennsylvania. The Cedars, McPherson, Kansas. Timbercrest, North Manchester, Indiana. The Bridgewater Retirement Community, Bridgewater, Virginia. Good Shepherd Homes, Fostoria, Ohio. Londonderry Village, Palmyra, PA. The Brethren Retirement Community, Greenville, Ohio. The Peter Becker Home, Harleysville, Pennsylvania. Spurgeon Manor, Dallas Center, Iowa. So let's give them all a... So did you have a good night? Okay, it is a little early. I am grateful that you were all in your rooms by curfew. I don't want to have to call your parents or your pastors if we catch you out late at night. So, our total registration is 551, but not all of those folks have arrived yet, so I'm hoping that they'll show up. And we have 30 people who have registered for the virtual conference, apart from the retirement communities. As Eddie reminded you, you'll need to pick up a songbook when you come in the morning, and again when you come in the evening. We recommend you drop them off just so you don't have to lug them around all day. We have asked that the trolley was originally just running till 10. I know it said 11 on the slide, but Eddie, you'll need to change that. We're gonna ask them to run till 10:30 since most of the evening sessions end at 10 o'clock. So we hope that worked out well. Okay, here are field trip instructions. Listen closely. If you are going on a field trip, the buses will load in front of Terrace. So you will pick up your pre-ordered sandwich or salad in the grassy area. There'll be tables set up. You'll pick it up there and a bag of chips. Find the vehicle for your trip, which would be either a van or a coach bus. They'll have signs in the windows. Have your ticket ready. Board the bus. A bag lunch and a bottle of water will be in each seat. And then enjoy your field trip. If you are in the choir and you are going on a field trip, just get here to choir practice as soon as you get back. Bev understands that people will be taking field trips and will be back after choir begins. The exhibit hall and the bookstore will basically be open between we're closed during keynotes and worship. So from 9 to 10 in the morning, 11:30 to 5, and then from 9 to 10. Mark Charles will have a book signing at the NOAC bookstore in the basement of Harrell from 1 to 1:30 this afternoon, and then he will have a talk back session, question and answer. Don't talk back to him, okay? It's rude. It's just rude. From 2 to 3 in the Terrace Auditorium, if you want to hear more about what he's telling us today, and he will lead a workshop tomorrow afternoon, and that will be in Harrell 201. It's my privilege to introduce you to Mark Charles, who is the first NOAC speaker who actually campaigned for president of the United States. I think he probably wishes you would have voted for him instead of just clapping. The theme of his campaign in 2020 was this: let's build a nation where we, the people, actually means all people. You better run again. Mark sees God working in new ways in his own life as he has learned over the past several years to relate to God as creator and as spirit. An important spiritual discipline for him is watching the sunrise over the Potomac River near his home in Washington, D.C. Through his social media pages, he has gathered a community of faithful sunrise watchers. And he thinks the church should learn how to watch the sunrise as a way of seeing this new thing that God is doing. His deepest hope is that the church would understand the radical inclusivity of God, our Creator, and as Spirit. Mark brings a unique perspective on faith, activism, and life that the Church of the Brethren needs to hear today. I highly recommend the book he co-wrote entitled Unsettling Truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the doctrine of discovery. That book will tilt the way you understand the history of our nation and our world. If you follow Mark on Facebook, through his photos, you get to enjoy the beauty of the sunrise, and through your imagination, you get to enjoy the imagined taste of his fresh fry bread and really hearty stew. Brother Mark, we are blessed by your presence with us in this place this morning. I apologize that you did not get to see the sunrise. And now, just a minute. Mark will be speaking with us in just a minute, but first, to start your morning off in a very interesting way, Dave, Chris, and Larry, NOAC News.
And now, more or less live from Lake Junaluska, it's time for NOAC News, serving the National Older Adult Conference for 1.9% of a millennium, and featuring your crack NOAC News team, dedicated to the notion that notions need to be dedicated. Organically grown and gluten-free, NOAC News starts right about now.
People of NOAC, we're just so delighted that we have this year a wonderful Brethren Saint as our chaplain, Chaplain I.N.H. Beam. Now, you know her mother called her Isaac Newton Harvey Beam, but most people called her I.N.H. Beam. She is a wonderful minister. She did so many wonderful things for people in the ministry, preaching.
Yep, and teaching, and like to ride the train.
Yeah.
And got the train conductor to stop the train in Noakesville.
That's right.
Even though it wasn't a regular stop on the train.
It wasn't a stop there.
Yeah.
We know these things. We know
Because of this book.
We know these things because we wrote a book about you.
The
little. Well, that's just the thing they had to use back in those days, you know. But we know who you are, and
you're an annual conference moderator.
Annual conference moderator, and people got they got confused, but you stood up and say, "I'm not confused."
Well, I'm not confused either. I am Chaplain Beam. I am Martha Beam. I.N.H. was a great man who did many things for the brethren.
Yeah.
But he was my grandfather's brother.
Oh.
So
But you are our chaplain.
I am a chaplain.
Okay, well, sorry about
I
the
am
confusion.
the conference chaplain.
Where could people find you if they'd like to come and talk?
If they they can call, I think the desk at Herald, and the Herald desk.
Information
Center?
Center?
They will. The information center will give you a call.
Okay.
I'll be staying up at Lambeth, but you don't need to go up there unless you want to hike.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being with us. Sorry for the confusion.
Well, that's all right. It's not the first time.
Hello, NOAC Workshop sports fans. I'm here to introduce you some representatives of each day's workshops. Starting on Tuesday today, virtual field trip, Rwanda and Uganda by Dave Sullenberger. And God's New Thing Can Happen in Pastor and Congregational Partnerships by Nancy Sullenberger Heisman. Cheryl Broomball Kayford is here representing the workshop Centenary, the EYN Centenary. And that's Tuesday's workshops. There'll be other workshops that you can find on pages 20 to 22 in your booklet, and the time will be 2 to 3:30 for all workshops. And now, representatives of our Wednesday's workshops. Dave Sullenberger will be with us again to do virtual field trip, Don Durnsball's History of the Church of the Brethren. Sharon Franzen will represent We Are Called to Serve. Yeah, Sharon. And Cheryl Broomball-Caford doing another workshop on Ask the Editors. And Lowell Flory giving us Immigrant Trails of the Old West. There'll be more workshops on Wednesday. Look on pages 23 to 24 for the location. All right, and now representatives of Thursday workshops. And guess who's first? David Sullenberger, virtual field trip, 300-year celebration of the church. Yes, and representing the mission advancement team, Nancy McCrickard and Shannon McNeil Smith. Remember when? Taking a stroll through Brethren history. And Donna Rhodes will also be on Thursday, planting seeds for ministry. These are our representative workshop leaders. Please find the names of your other workshops and the days in your booklet.
We're with Francis Townsend, who's going to be doing the tie-dyeing for all the arts and crafts on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And so we have a couple of questions, don't we, Larry?
Yeah, we do, Francis. So Chris and I would like to participate, but we need to let you know that all of our ties have dyed. So can you tie-dye without ties?
Yes. Actually, I never make knots in anything.
Oh, okay.
It's easier than that. It's easier than that.
Okay.
So you gotta pull it tight and then let it sit. It doesn't even need to be tied.
Okay. Where will you be doing this, Francis?
I'll be doing this outside of Stewart Auditorium under the big white tent.
Right.
Okay.
And what time is that? You're doing it Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, right?
Yes.
What time?
I don't know when it says in the book. I'll be there from after lunch until it gets dark.
Okay.
Wow, she's committed. Very committed to this tie-dyeing activity. There will be lots of tie-dyeing.
Right there.
Come and enjoy.
Come and play. It will be fun. I have hundreds of shirts to dye. Somebody has to dye all of those. I need help.
We're delighted to be with Jen King. Jen's going to be leading one of the arts and crafts today, and it's called potpourri of herbs.
Yeah.
Now,
Never
Jan,
heard of that before.
Yeah, well, Jan, Chris is a really smart guy, and he has figured out what this arts and crafts is about.
So this is how I've sleuthed it. All right. So the purry part reminds me of a cat purring. So I'm thinking cat, and you've got a pot. So it said something of potpourri of herbs. Okay. So we're planting herbs in a pot, and if they have to do with a cat, then it must be catnip. Catnip. We're planting catnip in a pot.
That's it, right, Jen?
Whoa. That's not at all what we're talking about.
I'm sorry.
It's called potpourri
Potpourri of
herbs. Potpourri. And
So
do you know what that is? It's a little gathering of herbs in a little kind of netting that you will take home with you, and it has all different aromas to it. Now here's the thing.
Do you eat it?
No, you don't eat it.
Oh, okay.
But did you ever wonder what Jesus did when he had a tummy ache? Did that ever occur to you?
He probably just healed himself.
I don't know. That's not good.
I think maybe mint. Do you think?
Oh, I see.
Yeah, mint. And did you ever wonder what, let's say, frankincense and myrrh look like?
Wow.
Did you ever see them?
No.
Frankincense.
No. If you come to the workshop, you're going to get to see them.
Really?
Absolutely.
Wow.
So we're going to be doing this potpourri of herbs. Could you repeat that?
Potpourri
of herbs
Yeah.
on today
Today
at the Herald Center
from 2 to 3:30.
from 2 to 3:30, room 105. And I'd love to see you there.
thank
Thank
you.
There'd be
so
a
much,
lot
Lynn.
for you to learn.
Thanks for straightening us out.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
And go for it.
Hey, what are you guys doing?
Hi,
What are you
Jeff. How
doing?
you doing?
Hey, what's going
there.
on? What are you doing?
Well, you know, this is a book signing. We're just coming over. We're signing some of the books.
You're signing
It'll
books?
speed things up. There won't be any lines, you know, so they just can get their book right away. Chris, who are you signing for, Chris?
Mark Charles and Oshita Moore.
Shooting more, and,
Yeah.
and I'm signing
just
for
like 'em.
Christina Booker and for Bob Neff. And I'm doing Ted Swartz too. I really wanted to do Ted. See, we just signed.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's-
best wishes. Hope you enjoy the book.
Well, that's
Right there.
That's really nice of you guys. That's very kind of you. That's not how it works.
What?
How's it
No,
work?
the author gets to sit here, sign their book, and talk to the people who bought the book and write a little nice note to them of thanks. I mean, sure, it would save time, but I don't think that's how they want to do it.
So when is this happening, Jeff? So people will know.
Well, Mark Charles will be here tomorrow. You can come see him, or
Tuesday at
yeah, Tuesday from 1 to 1:30, and then on Thursday we got Oshita Moore. She was also at National Youth Conference, and people loved her. And then on Wednesday, Chris and Bob, they're doing Bible studies all week. 1 to 1:30, they'll be here for Luke and Acts.
right. Okay.
Is Ted going to be here to sign it all? Did he say?
I don't know. I don't think so.
Oh, okay. Well, I've signed some. If people,
Yeah, maybe
you know,
people like
people like
that.
that. I mean, I signed his name, so you know, yeah.
I'm sure you'd have fun with that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for getting
Thanks
this.
for
we
setting
just-
us
we just
straight.
need to- yeah,
All right.
Yeah. So, thank you, Jeff.
You've been watching NOAC News. NOAC News is intended for mature audiences. Viewer discretion advised. Do not drive or operate heavy machinery while watching NOAC News. If rash, irritation, redness, or swelling develops, discontinue watching NOAC News immediately and consult your doctor. And as always, please watch responsibly.
Yat binnen. Mark Charles Yinish, yeah. Sin bekay dena nishle, do tohu glini bashachin. Sin bekay dena dashache, do tohu chitni dashanella. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. We're matrilineals of people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Sin bekay dena nishle. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the Wooden Shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsinbeke. And my fourth clan, my father's father, is Totochitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I want to acknowledge today that here at Lake Junaluska, we are actually standing on the lands of the Cherokee, the Yuchi, and the Muskogee. These are the nations who were living here, hunting here, farming here, fishing here, raising their families here, burying their dead here, long before Columbus got lost at sea. These are their lands. They are indigenous to these lands. Their creation stories take place in these lands. They tell them why that mountain lies over there, why that river flows over here. These are the lands that they are indigenous to. And I want to honor these nations as the host people of these lands. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to remind myself to humbly walk on these lands because there is a history and a story to those lands that go far beyond what some white men wrote down in their books. If you will join me just by giving a round of applause to these nations and thanking them for their stewardship of these lands. So the theme of this conference is God is doing a new thing. Now, if you're like me and you've been around the church for a long time and you've read most parts of the Bible and you know a lot of things being said in the Bible, I'm sure one of you thought for a moment about Ecclesiastes, right? Is this conference heretical? Right? Are we actually talking about Scripture? Because in Ecclesiastes, what are we told? What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Usually I'm the oldest person in the room where I'm talking. Today I'm one of the youngest, so you know even better than I do, right? There is very few things that are new under the sun. Right? We see a lot of things, just trends and things going over and over and over again. So maybe instead of asking the new thing God is doing, we should look back and say, what about that new thing God did? Maybe what has been done has already been. There's nothing new under the sun. And what I want to do for the next hour and a half is I want to talk to you about two new things that Creator did. And Creator's people and the church and followers of Creator did not like this new thing that Creator tried to do, rebelled against it, and created a pretty big mess out of it. Now, if you follow the news, right, and it was said before, I ran for president. I was an independent candidate in the 2020 race. And my theme for my campaign was let's build a nation where for the very first time, we the people actually means all the people. Most of you probably never heard of me, and that's because the media did not like to cover my campaign. They would literally write me out of campaign stories. Events I attended, places I was, they would actually write me out of the story. I was at one event with the major Democratic candidates, Elizabeth Warren and others were there, Bernie Sanders. And one article that appeared in Esquire magazine was titled, Elizabeth Warren was well received at the Native American Forum, but Mark Charles was the main event. So whenever I was on stage with him, I held my own, but the media did not like to cover it. So you probably didn't hear about it, but writing my book, so I'm the co-author of a book called Unsettling Truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the doctrine of discovery, which the Church of the Brethren has been wrestling with the doctrine of discovery. You came out with a resolution in 2023 out of your general conference, and you are wrestling with that history, and the book I co-authored with my good friend Sing Chan Ra goes deep into the history and its legacy, its dehumanizing legacy on the history of our nation and the history of the church. Part of my presentation, the first half of my presentation, will come from chapters 3 and 4 of that book and other sections of that book. Part of my presentation, actually most of my presentation tomorrow in the workshop in the afternoon is looking most specifically at two of the chapters in the book, which are the two hardest chapters to read, which are chapters 9 and 10, which deal with the mythological legacy of Abraham Lincoln. And I'm actually writing a new book now. The new book I'm writing is called Decolonizing Faith. And it's wrestling with the faith that my grandparents, who were boarding school survivors, inherited. What was passed down to my father and to me. And what does it mean to be a part of this faith, a follower of this God that is defined in the Scriptures? And where did the missionaries not only get it wrong, but where do the Scriptures have some very challenging things to say? And so that book, I'm working on it. And the second half of my presentation today is probably going to be the first chapter of the book I'm writing right now called Decolonizing Faith. That's just going to open the doors into some things the church needs to consider. Now, I have to warn you, over the next 80 to 90 minutes, I'm going to offend pretty much everyone in the room. Another reason you haven't heard of me, another reason the book I co-authored, well, it's doing well. We've sold about 35,000 copies, I think. It's doing well, but it's not a New York Times bestseller. The reason it's not a New York Times bestseller is because we make a very bipartisan critique. If you want to write a bestseller, you have to critique the right or the left. You can't critique both sides. You have to really upset one side and inflame and empower the other side, and that's how you write a best-selling book. If you critique both sides, everyone is like, well, what you're saying is true, but I don't really want to talk about it. And so over the next hour and a half, I'm going to offend pretty much everybody in the room. Doesn't matter if you lean to the left or lean to the right. Doesn't matter if you end your evenings with CNN or Fox News. Doesn't matter if you're a theologian or even a Sunday school teacher. I'm going to say something at some point during this next hour and a half where you are going to be looking for a polite way to leave the room. I'm also going to say some things that you're going to feel like I'm picking on you, and the person sitting next to you is not squirming near as much because maybe they have different leanings than you do. Don't worry, give me a few minutes. I will soon make them squirm just as much as you are squirming. So we're going to have a bipartisan critique here. And to kick it off, I want to start with a conversation that began really during the 2020 election, even some before that, but it has really amplified itself over the last few years, which is the debate over white Christian nationalism. Now, the challenge we have as a nation is we are very poorly equipped to have a conversation as nuanced as something as white Christian nationalism. Our media is way too partisan. We live in these social media worlds that just feed us these videos and these sayings from our little bubbles of influence, and we are so poorly equipped to have a discussion about something as deep and as foundational as the understanding of white Christian nationalism. And just to prove my point, right? If we go back just a few years, let's go back to June 1st of 2020. You remember this day very well because there's a photo that was taken that day, right? George Floyd has just been lynched a little while prior in Minnesota. We are having protests about police violence all over the country, and there is a park in Washington, D.C. called Lafayette Park. It's right in front of the White House. There are protesters there every day protesting police violence and aggressive policing tactics. Is everyone okay there? Okay. That morning, the police go out and they aggressively clear the park. A few hours later, our president, Donald Trump, walks out of the White House. He walks through the park. There's a church on the other side of the park. He stands at the church and he holds up his Bible. It's upside down at first. He turns it around, takes a picture, and this got burned into all of our minds, right? This image right here. He said very little, took his picture, and walked back, and he was immediately called out for exactly what he was doing, which he was giving a dog whistle to white Christian nationalists. Everyone saw that's what he was doing. Everyone knew that's what he was doing. There was no even pretending he wasn't trying to do that, but this is what came out. This was the narrative, and this image got burned into all of our brains. Now, again, the problem is we think white Christian nationalism is primarily a right-leaning thing. We think if we could just get rid of Donald Trump and people leaning to the right and the Republican Party, we would have a much better history, we would have a much better way to move forward, and we would solve a whole lot of problems if we could just vote the other party out of office and only go with one side or the other. However, during the 2020 election, right, we had two major candidates besides me. We had Donald Trump and we had Joe Biden. Now, after the lynching of George Floyd, right, they both laid out their suggestions of how we deal with this police violence. Donald Trump said maybe we might want to think about possibly banning one or two types of chokeholds. Joe Biden came up with the brilliant idea of training our officers to shoot people in the kneecaps instead of in the chest. Neither one of those helped Jacob Blake, who was shot 12 times in the back a few weeks later. They weren't willing to deal with the root of the problem, which is our foundations. Our Declaration of Independence that refers to natives as merciless Indian savages. Our Constitution that counts black people as 3/5 of a person. and codifies slavery in our criminal justice system and specifically excludes natives. And so during his campaign, because Donald Trump had the reputation of being someone who did his foreign policy very aggressively over Twitter, he had the reputation of not being to speak very well and not being very eloquent. So Joe Biden promised if we would elect him as president that he would bring statesmanship back into the White House. He promised he would speak in complete sentences. He promised he would stop doing his foreign policy over social media, right? He promised all of these things. And he got elected, and a few months into his term in office, he had a test, which is we had a terrorist attack. It wasn't on our soil, it was overseas in Afghanistan, and several of our service members died during that terrorist attack. It was so bad and so public that he had to make a statement about it. And so on June 26 of 2021, Joe Biden made a statement regarding the terrorist attack in Afghanistan. And he said, to those who carried out this attack, as well as anyone who wishes America harm, know this: we will not forgive, we will not forget, we will hunt you down and make you pay. I will defend our interests and our people with every measure at my command. Now, just a few months ago, Vladimir Putin said something very similar, right? That if he was invaded and Russia was invaded in their territory, that he would use every measure at his command to defend his territory. And Americans, especially Democrats, said, how can you talk that way? You're a nuclear power, you're threatening nuclear war. How dare you make those kind of threats? Even though our own president made those kind of threats just a few years earlier. And this is the same kind of threats that Donald Trump made just a few years earlier to that, and that other presidents made just a few years earlier to that. This is the way our presidents speak. This is the way we talk. He went on in his speech. He wanted to thank the Secretary of Defense and the military leadership, for the commanders in the field, for the way they've been working together to bring this thing to a closure. And then Joe Biden said, those who have served through the ages have drawn inspiration from the book of Isaiah when the Lord says, whom shall I send and who shall go for us? And the American military has been answering for a long time, here am I, Lord, send me. Here I am, send me. In his State of the Union, Joe Biden used the word sacred twice. He used it once in reference to the Capitol. It was a sacred space to be giving his speech. And he used it once in regards to our sacred duty, our sacred responsibility to take care of our veterans. Now, I do not disagree. We have an absolute moral obligation to take better care of people who fight wars on our behalf. But he used the word sacred. Why? Because Joe Biden believes the U.S. military is the army of the Lord, responding to a prophetic call on par with that of Isaiah the prophet. If you think white Christian nationalism is merely a problem for the right, please, for the love of God, turn off CNN. Get off of your social media feeds. Right? This is why I write these books. This is why I give these lectures, because we are so ill-equipped to have these conversations. Right? CNN is not going to tell you this news. It didn't play on their stations. Why? It would destroy the advertising in their primary demographic. Fox News didn't announce this. Why? They don't have the theological acumen to understand what Joe Biden was saying. Right? This is why we have to be aware of what we're being fed. And white Christian nationalism is not a problem for just one party. It is not a partisan problem. Donald Trump absolutely is a white Christian nationalism, and so is Joe Biden. The Republicans, and not just white evangelicals, are white Christian nationalists, and so are Democrats and people leaning to the left. This nation was built on a history of white Christian nationalism. And if we don't understand that, we are never in our lives going to be able to fix it. And Creator's been trying. right? To understand this history, we have to go back a long time. We have to go back to Old Testament Israel, when the people of Israel had a land covenant with the God of Abraham. The land covenant stated that if they obeyed God and kept God's commands, they would be blessed and they would prosper in their lands. We see this very clearly in Deuteronomy chapter 30, where as they're about ready to cross into Canaan to take possession of their promised lands, they are reminded of their land covenant that says that if we keep his commands and his ordinances, and the laws of our covenant with him, that we may live and be multiplied, and that the Lord our God may bless us in the land. But if our hearts shall turn away so that we will not obey, and we worship other gods, we will surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river to possess it. So the people of Israel had a land covenant with the God of Abraham, and one of the barometers for their covenant was their prosperity. It wasn't their only barometer. But if they were exiled from their lands, if they were hungry, if their borders were porous, if their families were not well, that was a fairly good sign something was amiss in their relationship with God. If their borders were strong, if their people were secure, if their families were healthy, that was a good sign something was going well in their relationship with God. The people of Israel had one of their barometers in their relationship with the God of Abraham was their prosperity. So when Jesus came into the world, the people were looking for something, but God was doing a new thing. The people were waiting for a Messiah. They were waiting for a political Messiah to restore the nation of Israel to the prominence of the greatness of the kingdom of David. They were looking for someone to destroy their enemies, bring them back into prosperity, and restore them to their promised lands. They were living under now the oppression of the Romans. They could not worship freely. They could not move freely. They were being taxed. They were not able to be who they were supposed to be. And they were waiting for God to send his Messiah to come and restore them back to the greatness of the kingdom of David. Now, Jesus knew who he was, and he knew what he was coming for, but he also knew that Creator was doing a new thing. And so, yes, Jesus was the Messiah. Yes, he came to this earth. But he was born in a barn, and he grew up as a refugee. Yes, he was the Son of God, and angels announced his coming. But they were singing to lowly shepherds. Right? Early in his ministry, Jesus was taken to a high place by Satan and shown the kingdoms of the world because Satan thought that was the goal. And he told Jesus, if you bow down to me, I will give you these kingdoms. Jesus knew that wasn't the goal. He rebuked Satan and he walked away. A little while later in Luke chapter 7, John the Baptist was in prison and he heard some things about Jesus that were troubling. He heard that Jesus was healing the children, raising from the dead the children of widows, and he was healing the servants of Roman centurions. This was not what the political, imperial Messiah was supposed to be doing, and so John sent his disciples to Jesus and said, hey, are you the one we're waiting for, or should we look for somebody else? I love Jesus, right? He heard the question, he turned around, he healed more sick people, gave sight to more of the blind, hearing to more of the deaf, he took care of more of the poor, and he said to John's disciples, go back and tell your master what you've seen, and blessed is the man who doesn't stumble on my account. He's rebuking John. He said, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing, either get on board or get out of the way. A little while later in John 6, Jesus was out teaching. They were in a lonely place. The people didn't have anything to eat. The disciples noticed they were hungry and brought the message to Jesus. And Jesus said, you're right, they are hungry. So he found this kid. He shook him down, grabbed his lunch, broke it apart, and fed everybody, right? They were excited. The people were so thrilled to see this teacher who spoke wisely in these profound things, also was able to multiply food and feed them, and they came to make him king by force. But that was not the goal. And so Jesus walked away. In Mark chapter 8, After Jesus had spent a significant amount of time with his disciples, he's up on a high place, and he asks his disciples who people thought he was. And they said, well, some think you're John the Baptist, come back to life. Others think you're Elijah. Others think you're one of the prophets of the Old Testament. He said, how about you? Who do you think I am? Peter, who was the spokesperson for the group, said, I think you're the Messiah. Now, Jesus didn't go, ding, 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 you're right, let's go tell everybody, right? He said, shh, don't tell anybody. And then he began teaching the disciples that the Messiah, the Son of God, was going to be persecuted and even die on a cross. And to make matters worse, he said not only was he going to be persecuted, but his disciples were going to be persecuted. He said they will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and put you in prison. You will be brought before kings and governors, all on account of my name. You will be betrayed even by parents, brothers and sisters, relatives and friends. They will put some of you to death. Everyone, he said, will hate you because of me. Now, like you and I, the disciples were not excited about this prospect. And so Jesus had Peter come to him, and Peter said, Lord, you don't have to do this, right? You don't have to die. And Jesus saw the other disciples listening to him, maybe feeding off of his idea, and he looked at Peter and he said, get behind me, Satan. You are not on the side of God, but of men. He went on even to teach. And he began to change their barometer. Instead of you will be blessed and you will prosper, he said, blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and say all kinds of things about you. Rejoice in those times. Jesus was not just doing something new and focusing on relationship instead of on building an empire, but he was changing their barometer from one of prosperity to one of suffering. The disciples would know they were doing well in their discipleship with Jesus, not by how prosperous they were, but by how crappy their lives were, by how much they were suffering on account of the message they were bringing forth with Jesus' name on it. That was going to be their new barometer. The disciples didn't like this one bit. And the whole second half of the book of Mark is Jesus basically debating back and forth with his disciples about his vision and God's new idea and their desire to hang on to the old way of doing things. And it ended with them coming for Jesus in the garden, the disciples making one last valiant effort. Peter takes out his sword, cuts off one of the servant's ears, and Jesus rebukes Peter for what he's done. He picks up the ear, puts it back on. The disciples flee. Jesus gets arrested and gets brought before Pilate. Now, Pilate has the responsibility of what do we do with Jesus? He doesn't want to kill him. He's actually looking for a way to set him free. But Jesus isn't helping his case because he's not answering the questions. Finally, Pilate gets frustrated and says, don't you know I have the authority to set you free or to kill you? Jesus scoffs at him. You have no authority over me. The only authority you have is what my Father in heaven gave you. He said, my kingdom's not of this world. If it was, my servants, the angels, not my friends, my disciples who I call my friends, they would come and prevent my arrest. He said, no, my kingdom is from another place. Adamant until the very bitter end, he was doing something new. He was not going to establish an earthly empire. He was coming to plant a church, to do something radically different. And because of his vision, because of the pathway of it, because of what he said, he died completely and utterly alone. Everyone left him. It wasn't until his resurrection and after his resurrection, that the disciples finally began to get on board that what he was saying might be true. And one by one, they bought into it. And so when you joined the church in the first century, you were joining this ragtag group of people who were defined by their fellowship, their baptism, and their community. And you knew that when you joined this group, there was a good chance you were going to be persecuted for being with them, and you might even be put to death. It stayed this way up through the 3rd century. In the 4th century, there was a radical shift in the church. And if you're like me, maybe all my life, I've blamed the heresy of Christendom, of Christian empire, on Constantine, right? He's the one who converted. He made Rome Christian. He moved the capital. I've always blamed the heresy of Christian empire on Constantine. But in researching our book, Unsettling Truths, and going more in depth into it, I found that Constantine was being discipled, was being mentored by someone, and his name was Eusebius. He was the bishop of Caesarea. And in the 4th century, Eusebius was writing a book called Ecclesiastical History, the history of the church. He was trying to do something that had never been done before, which is to write down a full account of the history of the church. It's actually a volume of 11 books. The first several books establish the divinity of Christ. Then it goes on in the later books to talk about the persecution and the martyrs of the church, and it holds them up in high esteem as these are people who are sharing in the suffering of Christ. And then in book 8, he introduces a new character named Constantinius. And he talks about him in more glowing terms, which is confounding because most empires were persecuting the church, and now we have one who's much nicer. And then he introduces Constantinius' son, who is Constantine, and he ordained Constantine as a God-ordained emperor of Rome. Now, between books 8 and 9, there's inserted a book. It's called the Book of the Martyrs. And in this book, Eusebius talks about the worst persecution in the history of the church, which is the great persecution of the early 4th century. It was one of the bloodiest persecutions in the history of the church. And he writes down and has an account that he saw some of the people die with his own eyes, and that some of the people who died were people he knew personally. It took place in his backyard in Caesarea and in Palestine. So the persecution touched him. It was no longer an idea, something far off. He saw the results. He bore the emotions of it. It touched him. And then books 9, 10, and 11, his whole attitude towards martyrdom begins to change. And instead of focusing on the piety of the martyrs, he begins focusing on what we can do to get the emperors to change their actions. Now, if you're writing a book called Ecclesiastical History, right? The fact that you're writing the book means your book doesn't have an ending. There's no conclusion. Because the history of the church will conclude when the bridegroom of the church returns. Because you're writing the book, that hasn't happened yet. So you must know that at best you're writing an early chapter or even a prelogue to what could be a very, very, very long saga. But if we read the entire book of Ecclesiastical History as it's told by Eusebius, and we get to the last section, the last paragraph of the last chapter of the last book. This book is called Eusebius, the victory of Constantine and the blessings under him accrued to the whole Roman world. It says that at that same time they celebrated and extolled their, first of all, God, the universal king, because thus they were taught. Then they also celebrated the praises of the pious emperor, and with him all his divinely favored children. The supreme God granted from heaven above the fruits of his piety, the trophies of victory over the wicked and nefarious tyrant with all his counselors and adherents. He cast prostrate, not at the feet of Christ, but at the feet of Constantine. You see, according to Eusebius, ecclesiastical history has a conclusion in the 4th century. And the conclusion is not the salvation that comes through Christ, but the salvation that comes to Rome through Constantine. You see, once the great persecution touched Eusebius, and he decided he no longer liked this new paradigm of suffering that Jesus brought in. He no longer liked the idea of a church. He wanted a physical empire, something he could touch, something that could keep him safe. He decided to plant the heresy of Christendom into his mentee, Constantine. And if you're writing a history of the church, and your goal is to create a Christian empire, you have a huge obstacle to get over, which is Christ, right? Because Christ was adamant he did not come to create a Christian empire, he came to plant a church. And the barometer of the church was not prosperity, but suffering. And so if you want to change that, you actually have to address Christ. And so if you're writing an ecclesiastical history, the way you deal with that is you write Christ out of the history of the church and you insert Constantine, which is exactly what Eusebius did in his book Ecclesiastical History. His next book, The Life of the Blessed Constantine, was flat out heresy. Chapter 4 was titled How God Honored Constantine. Chapter 6 was titled He Was the Servant of God and the Conqueror of Nations. Chapter 7 was titled He Conquered Nearly the Whole World. What did Satan promise Jesus if he would bow to him? The whole world. Chapter 18 was titled How While He Was Praying, God Sent Him a Vision of a Cross of Light in the Heavens at midday with an inscription admonishing him to conquer by that. And chapter 29 was titled, How the Christ of God appeared to him in his sleep and commanded him to use in his words a standard made in the form of a cross. Now there was another person who Christ appeared to after his resurrection, right? So Constantine claimed he saw a vision, and Christ appeared to him in the vision and told him to conquer under the form of a cross. Well, there was someone else who saw a vision of Jesus, which was Paul, right? He was traveling to persecute the Christians, and Jesus appeared to him on the road, blinded him, and asked him what he was doing. He sent him stumbling into the next town, let him sit there for 3 days, and then sent Ananias to him to prophesy to him. And Ananias told Paul that he was now going to be the apostle to the Gentiles, and that he was going to suffer greatly in this work. Now, why? Was Jesus punishing Paul for what he had done? No. What was the new barometer? Suffering. So if Jesus told Paul that he was going to suffer in his discipleship, he absolutely would have told Constantine the exact same thing. Now, Constantine may have seen a vision. I'm not going to say he didn't see a vision, but I promise you, I guarantee you, I am absolutely 100% positive Constantine did not see a vision of Christ. Christ would never have appeared to someone and told them to go out and conquer and kill under the form of a cross. That never, ever, ever would have happened. But that's the story he told. And that's what got bit. That's what got written. And so in the 5th century, the church had a problem, which is we had this heresy known as Christian empire. Constantine fundamentally changed what it meant to be the church. Now, instead of joining the church through your baptism, your discipleship, and your community, now you join the church through your member, your citizenship in this empire. Radically changed what it meant to be the church. So the theologians of that day had to decide, do they collude with this heresy or do they prophesy to it? Augustine was one of the major theologians of the 5th century. Augustine is known for writing what? A just war theory. Now, a just war theory had two purposes. A, it was to help nations fight wars more justly. B, it was to justify how Christian members of these nations could go off and kill in the name of God and country, because a plain text reading of Jesus' teaching does not allow that. So you have to do some theological gymnastics to be able to justify that. So I use the fact that Augustine wrote a just war theory as proof that he was deciding to collude with this heresy instead of prophesy to it. But I want to know where he went off the rails. right? Because when you go off the rails with Jesus, he tends to call you out. So I read through his writings. I read through his teachings on the three kingdoms, or the two kingdoms. I read through his teachings on just war. And while he agreed that the kingdom of man was not like the kingdom of God, he said, but we have it now, so let's try to make it work. And then I read through his book on the correction of the Donatists. The Donatists were a heretical group. They were teaching things falsely. And in chapter 5 of this book, Augustine was asking a fairly valid question. He said, what's the role of a Christian king in a Christian empire? They had never had this before, right? They always had a pagan king in a pagan empire. For the first time now, they had a Christian king in a Christian empire. He said, what's the role of this king? And he decided that his role was to prevent and chastise with religious severity all those acts which are done in opposition to the commands of the Lord. He serves him by enforcing with suitable rigor such laws as ordain what is righteous, and he punishes what is the reverse. He goes on in chapter 6 to say, it is indeed better that men should be led to worship God by teaching than they should be driven to it by fear of punishment or pain. But many have found advantage in first being compelled by fear or pain, so they might afterwards be influenced by teaching. So he is saying the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire is to use the resources of the state to compel, through fear, punishment, and pain, obedience to the church and devotion to God. Right? If Jesus didn't have a problem saying to Peter, what are you thinking? You're not on the side of God, but of man, get behind me, Satan. He wouldn't hesitate for a moment to say the same thing to Augustine. What are you thinking? This was never the goal. Get behind me, Satan. But no one ever rebuked Augustine that way, and so his ideas got implanted in the church. After the teachings of Augustine, they laid the foundations for the Crusades, which was about expanding the empire as well as protecting Jerusalem. In the 13th century, we have another theologian who was wrestling with heretics. His name was Aquinas. And he was asking, what do we do with heretics? And he wrote that if the world has the right to kill people who break men's laws, how much more right does the church have to kill people who break God's laws? He said it's a much graver matter to corrupt the faith which quickens the soul than to forge money which supports temporal life. Wherefore, if forgers of money and other evildoers are forthwith condemned to death by the secular authority, how much more reason is there for heretics, as soon as they are convicted of heresy, to not only be excommunicated, but even put to death? So he's arguing the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire is not to kill people who don't keep the commands and the ordinances of the church. In the 13th century, we also have the introduction of this term called the infidel. This was applied to Muslims, to the Moors, later to indigenous people, anyone who didn't worship the God of the white European Christian male. This is a subhuman category. Now that we have this subhuman category, now we don't even need a just war theory to justify our wars, because now we can go to war on theological grounds. We're fighting the others. We're fighting the enemies of Christ. And so it's out of this in the 14th century, or the 15th century, that Pope Nicholas V writes out these words, and he says, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. This papal bull, along with other papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493, are collectively known as what we call the doctrine of discovery. It's essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their lands are yours to take. This is the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. They did not see them as human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was literally lost at sea, land in this new world, which was already inhabited by millions, and claimed to have discovered it. The first sentence of the first chapter of our book on Selling Truth says you cannot discover lands already inhabited. You can conquer those lands, you can steal those lands, you can colonize lands. You can't discover them unless your worldview informs you that the people living there are not human. This makes the doctrine of discovery a white supremacist and Christian nationalist doctrine that is the direct fruit of a church that has prostituted itself out to the empire. Now, the challenge is this doctrine gets embedded into the foundations of our nation. So in 1763, King George draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains, and he says to the colonists who are here, they no longer have the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upset the 13 colonies. They wanted access to those lands. So a few years later, they wrote a letter of protest. In their letter, they accused the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land, and they went on to state he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason the Founding Fathers used this inclusive term, all men, is because they had a very narrow definition of who was actually human. A few years later, this makes our declaration systemically white supremacist and Christian nationalist doctrine. A few years later, the Founding Fathers wrote another document. They begin this one with words, "We the people of the United States." This, of course, is the preamble to the Constitution. Now, if you read the Constitution, just a few lines later, down to Article 1, Section 2. Article 1, Section 2 is a part of the Constitution that determines who is and who is not a part of this union, who is and who is not covered by this Constitution. If you read Article Section 2, the first thing you have to note is it never mentions women. Now, this is important because if you read the entire Constitution, preamble through the 27th Amendment, you will find that there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns. 51 he, him, and his, who can run for office, who can hold office, even who's protected by this document. Women are not mentioned a single time in the entire Constitution. Now maybe you're thinking, well, Mr. Charles, that's the Old English, that's how they spoke. He referred to everyone. Yeah, you know why they spoke that way? They were sexist, right? Women couldn't vote, they couldn't own property, they were seen as property. They had no value. Old English was sexist. So Article 1, Section 2 never mentions women, specifically excludes natives, and counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. Who does that leave? 1787, that leaves white men. And technically, you had to be a white land-owning male to vote. You see, we don't think about this often enough. The purpose of our Constitution, the reason it was written, was to protect the interests of white land-owning men. A few years later, we had a Supreme Court case. It was Johnson versus McIntosh. This is 1823. Two men of European descent, they're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them bought the land from a native tribe. The other one bought the same land from the U.S. government, and they want to know who owned it. Who had the right to sell the land, the tribe or the government? The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had to determine the legal precedent for land titles. They ruled that discovery is what gave title to the land. And they go on to write, let me find it, Sarah. Discovery is what gave title to the land, and that possession, or that title was consummated by possession. Now, because discovery might actually hint or imply that natives might have some sense of sovereignty over our own lands, they have to clarify that. So a few paragraphs later, they clarified that, and they said, but the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages whose occupation was war and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. Basically, it said natives aren't human, so they only have the right of occupancy of the land, like a fish occupies water or a bird occupies air. Europeans are fully human. They have the right of discovery to the land, therefore they have the title to the land. This case, along with a few others in 1823 and between 1823 and 1830, create the legal precedent for land titles. That precedent and the doctrine of discovery are referenced by the Supreme Court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005. I don't have time to go into all of these cases. I have a TEDx talk online titled "We the People, the Three Most Misunderstood Words in U.S. History." It goes on to examine especially the 2005 case. I can identify that it is probably one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime. It references by name the doctrine of discovery, and it builds the exact same argument about savages that natives made, that John Marshall made in 1823. It just doesn't use the word. And that opinion was written and delivered by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, this is shocking, right? Because she was seen as someone who was fighting for the marginalized, which she was and which she did. But because land titles are based on the legal understanding that natives aren't human, this makes white supremacy a bipartisan value. In 1630, John Winthrop was on board a ship. He was in what's now called the Boston Harbor. He was here to plant the Boston colony with a group of colonists. And on board that ship, he preached a sermon titled A Model of Christian Charity. In this sermon, he referenced the Sermon on the Mount and the phrase, the city on a hill, where Jesus tells his disciples to be a lamp on a stand, a city on a hill, shining their good deeds into this dark world. He goes on to exhort them in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. They should rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. They should keep the unity of the Spirit within the bonds of peace. These are just your basic Protestant Christian exhortations. End of his sermon, he does what most pastors do, which to compel his congregants to heed his exhortations, he quotes from the Old Testament. So John Winthrop decides to quote from Deuteronomy chapter 30, the same passage we read earlier that says, "But if our hearts will turn away so that we will not obey and we worship other gods, we will surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river to possess it." Now, Deuteronomy 30 says river, but in his sermon, John Winthrop changes that to vast sea. Now, why does he do that? Well, they didn't cross a river, right? They crossed an ocean. So what's he saying? Based on the model of Jesus to be a city on a hill, based on the model of Old Testament Israel with their promised lands, they are standing on the shores of their promised lands, ready to go and take possession of them. Now, who's read the book of Deuteronomy and Joshua? Right? How are the people of Israel to take possession of their promised lands? Well, in Deuteronomy 20, it says, "In the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivitites, and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you." I refer to this sermon as the birth of the myth of American exceptionalism. This idea percolates for about 100 years. Mid-1700s, our nation begins expanding westward. We go past the Appalachian Mountains. We go past the Mississippi River. End of the 1700s, we have the Second Great Awakening. There's a growth in churches. There's a renewal within denominations. Early 1800s, the term manifest destiny is coined. The belief that this nation has the God-given right to rule these lands from sea to shining sea. I want very briefly to look at the history of our nation in the 19th century. I made this chart. This is the history of our nation from 1775 to 2016. Every year in blue is the year our nation was in a declared state of war or armed military conflict against another nation or entity. Every year in red is every year we were fighting native nations. You see from 1811 to 1886, we had almost 75 straight years of warfare against native nations. During this is a list of some of the wars we fought during that period. We had things like the Indian Removal Act, the hanging of the Dakota 38, the Sand Creek Massacre, the start of Indian boarding schools, and the massacre at Wounded Knee. If you draw a map of our nation, this is a map of our nation in 1840. The states to the east of this map are the actual states. They're in the dark color. Everything to the west is a territory or even uncharted lands. You can look up medals of honor awarded by Congress, by war, and by conflict. And if you look up medals of honor for the Indian War campaigns, you will find that between 1839 and 1898, the United States Congress awards 425 medals of honor to U.S. soldiers who participated in the Indian War campaigns. End of the period, this is what the nation looks like. We got all the way across the continent to the Pacific Ocean. During the 19th century, the majority population balloons from 5.3 million to 76.2 million, and the native population collapses from 600,000 to 237,000. If you're doing your math, that's a 61.47% rate of genocide. If you're comparing your math, that's almost twice the rate of genocide Hitler had over the Jews in Nazi Germany. So just to be clear, between 1839 and 1898, the United States Congress awards 425 medals of honor for the genocide of American Indians and the ethnic cleansing of this continent. And we knew what we were doing. In California, in 1851, Peter Burnett, who was the first governor of California, gave his State of the State address. And in his address, this is what he said: that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or the wisdom of man to avert. He's not saying disease has broken out and we can't stop its spread, nor is he saying famine has struck and we can't feed these people. He is literally saying we can't stop killing them until we complete our manifest destiny, which is perfectly in line with promised land theology. In Joshua 10, it says, "So Joshua subdued the whole region, including the hill country, the Negev, the western foothills, and the mountain slopes, together with all their kings. He left no survivors. He totally destroyed all who breathe, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded." Now, maybe you're thinking, Mr. Charles, that's a great story, but that's in the past. We don't think that way anymore. I want you to think back just a few years, 2015. President Obama was negotiating a nuclear deal with Iran. The Republicans and Israel did not like that deal. The Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, came here to lobby against that deal, and he spoke to a joint session of Congress. That Congress back then, just like today, was completely divided, weren't even talking to each other. And he had to unify everybody and get them on the same page politically. So early in his speech, this is what he said: "Because America and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands." If you want to know why the United States of America has bipartisan, almost unanimous support for Israel, it's because we have a codependent relationship with the modern nation state of Israel. Has very little to do with freedom or equality. We need Israel's Old Testament legacy of promised land to justify what we did to Native people and African Americans. And Israel needs our flourishing as a nation with a manifest destiny to justify what they're doing to Bedouins and Palestinians. We have a very dysfunctional, codependent relationship with the modern nation state of Israel. It has almost nothing to do with freedom or equality. It's about justifying oppression. And in our case, even justifying genocide and enslavement. And this is why, to this day, white Christian nationalism is a massive, bipartisan problem that exists not in spite of our Constitution, but because of it. I am absolutely convinced that the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation I would put on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that happened in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. But I would not call ours Truth and Reconciliation. Why? Because reconciliation is a misnomer. It implies there was a previous harmony. There was no conciliation in the first place. We don't need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We need a Truth and Conciliation Commission. We have to wrestle with this for the very first time. There's a quote that I love. It's by a leader, an Aboriginal leader in Canada. His name is George Erasmus. He used this quote in a letter he was writing about the the boarding school, the residential schools, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission they had there. And the quote he used said, "Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where communities to be formed, common memory must be created." I love this quote because it gets to the heart of our nation's problem, especially regarding race, which is we don't have a common memory. We have a white majority that remembers this mythological history of discovery and expansion, opportunity and exceptionalism. And we have communities of color that have the lived history of stolen lands and broken treaties, of enslavement and Jim Crow laws, of segregation and mass incarceration, of internment camps, families being ripped apart at our borders, and there's no common memory. And there's actually no point in our nation's history where we've had a healthy community across racial lines. It doesn't exist. In fact, this is why I ran for president in 2020. I wanted to help create this common memory. I wanted to enact and initiate this Truth and Conciliation Commission. I wanted to address our nation's problem with racism and sexism and white supremacy, not at the partisan level, at the foundational level. That's why I ran for president. And these desires flowed from my faith. These were desires I believe I had, given by God to treat all people as human, and to see the humanity and the agency and the value of every single person alive in this world. But you have to ask the question, why is it 2,000 years since the death and resurrection of Christ? And not only does the world struggle to acknowledge everybody's humanity, but the church struggles to acknowledge everybody's humanity. Halfway through my campaign, 3/4 of the way through my campaign, the summer of 2020, I was wrestling with God, how do I relate to you? I'm aspiring to be president. I'm a Gentile to the Jews. I'm a savage to Western Christianity. How do I relate to you? I remember very specifically praying this prayer in my house, crying out to God, God, how do I relate to you? And sometimes you pray these prayers and you get a vision that lasts over the courses of years, and God leads you through this path and you get to a conclusion. Other times you get something very clear and you're like, was that God or last night's pizza? Right? You're like, I'm not sure. It could be one of either. And I cried out to God, how do I relate to you? And the first thought that came into my mind was the passage where Jesus is interacting with the Canaanite woman. You all know this passage. Probably some of the most dissatisfying sermons you've ever heard were preached on this passage. Right? Because somehow we as preachers find a way to make Jesus the good guy in that passage. If you don't know the passage, right, it's the story of this Canaanite woman, this Gentile woman, comes to Jesus and meets his disciples and says, I want Jesus to heal my daughter. She's possessed by a demon. The disciples send her away. She comes back tenaciously and gets to Jesus and says, I want you to heal my daughter. And Jesus says, I didn't come for you. I came for the Jews. But she doesn't give up. She comes back and says, I want you to heal my daughter. And Jesus says, why would I give to the dogs what was meant to the children? And the woman does not miss a beat. And she says, but even the dogs eat the scraps that are dropped from the table. And Jesus finally concedes. And he heals her daughter. And most sermons we preach about that passage include some kind of a wink that Jesus gave her, some kind of sparkle in his eye. He was wanting her to fight for her agency or doing something else, or he was doing something to use this. We always make Jesus look good, but I was running for president, right? And I was telling the nation, if you believe our Constitution was written to include everybody, read the document. I was telling people, get into a diverse groups of people and read our Constitution out loud, and you will be shocked and appalled at how quickly it becomes exclusive and divisive and even white supremacist. And I said, if we don't deal with what our Constitution says, we're never going to fix it. And so I thought to myself, I can't just negate what Jesus said here. I have to deal with what Jesus says, and this passage looks very clearly like Jesus is holding the ethnocentric views of his time. Right? The Jews hated the Samaritans. They were half Jews. They had sinned. They had married outside the faith. They worshiped in the wrong place, but they were related, so they had to at least respond to them. The Gentiles, they wanted nothing to do with them. They couldn't eat their food. They couldn't practice their culture. They couldn't form their ways. They were completely to be separate from them. In fact, they had gone on massive ethnic cleansing policies against Gentiles when they were taking their promised land. And so I said, what if Jesus actually said what it looks like he's saying, which is he's holding the ethnocentric views of his time. He's saying, I'm a Jewish Messiah, and I'm not supposed to relate to you. And the woman says, but even the dogs eat the crumbs. And Jesus says, you're right. And then he throws her a bone. And you know what he never does? He never corrects her. He never says, my child, you're not a dog. He doesn't say that. If you read the Gospels, whenever Jesus is impressed by someone's faith, he always, always, always gives them something more. He touches the leper. He goes home with Zacchaeus. He listens to the entire story of the bleeding woman. He goes even goes back to the village of the Samaritan woman. But for this Gentile, Jesus heals her and then just goes on his way. Does nothing outside to draw her in closer like he does when he interacts with Jewish people. So now I'm a little troubled. Because now I have a theological problem, right? Which is Jesus appears racist, or at least ethnocentric. So I decided to look through the Gospels through a framework I had never looked at it before, which is instead of looking at Jesus through the lens of Jew versus Samaritan, I looked at Jesus at the Gospels through the lens of Jew versus Gentile. And I asked myself, how many Gentiles did Jesus interact with in the Gospels? There's the Canaanite woman, but what else? I'm really scrolling through my Bible. I find the centurion. Right? Roman centurion, charged with keeping the peace, has a servant who's sick. He calls Jesus to come and heal him. Jesus is a good guy. He goes that way. The centurion knows what's going to happen if a prominent Jewish rabbi comes into his house, right? He knows it's not going to keep the peace. So he goes out, and he stops Jesus and says, you don't have to come into my house. You can do this remotely. We can fire up a Zoom session, right? You can heal her from out here. I have servants. I have people underneath me. I say to one, go, and he goes. One, come, and he comes. I know how this works. Just say the word. Jesus is amazed by his faith, and he heals the servant remotely. But he does not go any further. he goes on the way. So then I'm like, okay, well then if that's not the story where Gentiles get included, what is? Well, there's one more story with Gentiles, which is the demoniac. Jesus crosses the lake. He meets a demoniac who's living in the tombs. He heals the demoniac. The man sitting in front of Jesus in his right mind. And he's begging Jesus. Jesus gets ready to go, and the man is begging Jesus, let me follow you. And Jesus says, no. Go back to your people and tell them what God gave you today, but you may not follow me. And now I'm actually hurt. Because all of my adult life, I've imagined myself following Jesus. I've longed to be back in the first century, following Jesus, listening to his teachings, being one of his disciples. And to hear that, had I gone to Jesus as a Navajo man back in that point and asked if I could follow him, he would have said no. Not just to me, but to all of you, too. He would have said no. Now I'm actually getting desperate. I'm like, okay, God, where do I, as a Gentile, get written into this story? I go to Acts 2, which is one of the passages I always use about inclusiveness. The Holy Spirit falls on the disciples. They speak the languages of the nations. The church, the Acts 2 community, is birthed. But it says in Acts 2 that there were at that time Jews from every nation. Everyone in Jerusalem at that time was a proselyte. All the men were circumcised. Everyone ate kosher. They all went to synagogue. They all worshiped in Hebrew. Everyone, even though they were from multi-ethnic or multi-national backgrounds, they all had converted and assimilated to Judaism. It was not the radical multi-ethnic conference you were thinking of. They were all Jews, which is why they were surprised they were speaking in their own languages, because they were never used to that. They gave that up. So now I'm scrolling through the Bible. Where, God, where do I as a Gentile get included in? And I came across Acts 10. In Acts 10, Cornelius, a Roman centurion, sees a vision. He's a guy who loves God and cares for the poor. That's all we know about him. And God gives him a vision and says, go call Peter. Peter is on the rooftop praying at the time, and he falls into a trance. He sees a vision of this blanket being let down in front of him, and on this blanket is all these unclean animals. And he's told by the Spirit of God to kill those animals and eat them. Now, Peter was with Jesus in Mark chapter 6, when Jesus declared all foods were clean. He was there. But here in Acts 10, Peter definitively says, never, Lord, I've never eaten anything unclean. We might have said that stuff was clean, we never ate it. And it's true, read the Gospels. There's no example of Jesus eating unclean food with Gentiles. It doesn't happen. But Peter sees this vision 3 times. Finally, he's compelled to go to Cornelius' house when the people come. So he goes back with them to their house. He walks into Cornelius' home. He doesn't say, this is okay, this is fine. I remember Jesus did this with the Roman centurion, because Jesus never went into his home. So Peter walks into Cornelius' house and says, I shouldn't be here. You're a Gentile, I'm a Jew. I'm not supposed to be here. Tell me why you called for me. Cornelius tells him the story. Peter begins to preach to Cornelius and his family. As he's preaching, he sees the same spirit that God gave the Jews in Acts 2, now falling on uncircumcised Gentiles. And he is blown away. And he says, there is nothing to prevent me from baptizing these people. And the circumcised believers who were with Peter were astounded and said, even the Gentiles are included in this salvation that leads to life. They were blown away. They had no clue that their message was to be brought to uncircumcised Gentiles. The way you expanded Judaism was through proselytes. You expanded through marriage or through people converting and assimilating and becoming Jewish. You didn't go out and evangelize. It was a very long process to become a Jew. So when Jesus gave them this vision to bring the gospel to the nations, their whole framework for that was through proselytes. And Jesus never once interacted at length with uncircumcised Gentiles. The three in the Gospels, he held all of them at arm's length. Anyone even remotely close to Judaism, he welcomed in and went even beyond what they expected. But with Gentiles, he healed them, but he kept them at arm's length. You see, we have two theologies of Jesus. A big portion of the church, not all the church, and I'm not talking just the church of the brethren, but most churches, they see that the point of reconciliation between God and between Creator and people happens at the cross, right? This is why most churches celebrate communion. They see something pivotal happened at the cross, where God and creation are reconciled in some manner. And we preach that, and we even confess that when we take communion. But we preach Jesus, the Gospels, like that reconciliation happened at the birth. And even though Jesus tells us, I'm a Jew, I'm a Jewish Messiah, I came for the Jews, we have this, and I'm going to call it a heresy, that Jesus loved everybody. When he didn't, right? If you were the Canaanite woman, yeah, you got what you wanted, you didn't feel loved. You were called a dog, right? Jesus held them around. Jesus didn't come to keep the morality of the first century, even the morality of 2023 perfectly. He came to keep Old Testament law perfectly. And Old Testament law required him to be separate from the Gentiles. So the church, as it wrestled, especially the white European Christian church, it had to wrestle with this, right? Because you are just as much of a Gentile as me. Had you come to Jesus in the first century, you would have been told to go home. Had you met the God of Israel in your homeland, where the people of Israel are supposed to take their promised land, you too would have been ethically cleansed and wiped out, just like my people would have. Right? This is what would have happened. So how did European nations and the church wrestle with that teaching that says, yeah, Jesus came for the Jews? Where did we get this theology that Jesus loved everybody? Right? One of the examples, we see it most clearly in the Gospel of John, but the Gospel of John is one of the few Gospels that contains no interactions with Jesus and Gentiles. So if you want to have a theology that says Jesus loves you, not just died for you, not just came for you, not just reconciled you back to God, but actually loves you, you have to do one of two things. You either have to become Jewish, or you have to make Jesus look like you. So what did Western Christianity do? It made Jesus white. Now, because Jesus is white, Western Christians can treat savages the same way Jesus treated Gentiles, and you're not sinning because that's what Jesus did. When Jesus was comforting his disciples, right? He said, I'm going away. He said, that's a good thing for you because it means I can send you the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God will dwell in you, and the Spirit of God will empower you to do even greater things than I did. Now, we think that's hyperbole. But what Peter did in Acts 10 was absolutely greater than anything Jesus did in his earthly ministry because he baptized uncircumcised Gentiles into the church. He went against what he saw Jesus model. He went against what he was told as a Jewish man. He went against what he was taught in the synagogues and prayed in the temple. And when he saw the Spirit of God falling on uncircumcised Gentiles, Peter went with reckless abandon and ran to where the Spirit of God was and embraced who the Spirit of God was embracing and brought in this whole new demographic of people that had never, ever before been included, even by Jesus, into the community. God was doing something new. God was doing something new. And it was only by following the Spirit of God who was dwelling within them that Peter was able to embrace it. And these are the two challenges I want to give to you today. God God did something new. With the sending of Jesus, God did away with the understanding of Christian empire. The United States of America is not, never has been, nor will it ever be Christian. That is not the goal. That was never the goal. God did not want his church his people to plant an empire. He wanted them to build a church. And Jesus was very clear that after him, the Spirit of God was going to come and was going to do something even newer than what he did. And if the disciples knew what was good for them, they were going to follow that. And that's exactly what happened in Acts 10. And both times, the people of God and the followers of Jesus said, no, we don't want that. We would rather have our empire, and we would rather have our ethnocentric churches. We don't like this new thing that God did, and we're going to therefore reject it and keep doing the same old thing. And so, my brothers and sisters, I want to challenge you today to embrace the new thing that God did 2,000 years ago. I want you to open your eyes and to actively look where the Holy Spirit is, what the Holy Spirit's doing, and to go and run there with reckless abandon. And I want you to give up and to shed any understanding of the heresy of a Christendom or a Christian empire. This new thing God's doing is about relationship. It's not about institutions and empire. This new thing that God's doing is radically inclusive and not defined by our small, narrow-minded selves. And I pray that as a denomination, as a conference, as individuals, you will be able to get on board with the new thing that the creator of the universe and the Spirit of that creator is doing, and to see where we end up. Walk in beauty, my relatives, and may we all learn how to walk in this beauty together. Akihat. As we said earlier, I will be doing a book signing this afternoon at 1 to 1:30. And I will also be doing a talkback session, I think from 2 to 3, if I remember correctly. And then tomorrow I'm doing the workshop from 2 to 3:30, I believe it is. And that one's also coming from my book, Unsettling Truths. They have copies of Unsettling Truths at the bookstore. And they only have 60 copies there, so if you haven't bought it, you can get it there. I brought extras as well, so if they run out of the bookstore, I have some. And I also you can get it on my website, or you can get it from me personally. You can't get this through the bookstore, but I have a special that I do through my website, and that you can do if you meet me personally. I call it my book study special, where if you want to have a book study in your church with your group of Unsettling Truths and you buy 10 signed copies from me, I will give your book study a 45-minute virtual Q&A at some point over the next year with me about the book. So it costs $200 to buy the 10 books, but I will give you a virtual Q&A at some point whenever you schedule it with me over the next year. My assistant will be in touch with you, but you can talk to me if you want to purchase that. If you want individual books, go first to the bookstore and buy them there. When they run out, come to me. I have some more. But yeah, thank you so much. I'm around for the rest of the day and tomorrow, and I'm looking forward to having some good conversation. So thank you all.